joining us, me. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, half an hour, and just share the findings of a research project that we have been involved in over the last couple of years. So as I've said, please interrupt or save your questions to the end, whatever you prefer. So I'll give you a little bit of background to start with. So I come from a background in healthcare. So I've grown up very much being taught that we should all practice to an evidence base. So we should understand what what's helpful, what isn't, and then try and deliver the care that we are involved in a way that is consistent with that. So I, having opened as a funeral director a few years previously, I had two questions really that I wanted to answer. The first was I wanted to check whether the way that we were supporting people was consistent with the evidence base, and if not, how to adapt what we were doing to make sure that the way that we were supporting people was the best possible way. And the second question that I had is I wanted to understand whether there was any evidence that funerals have any impact on people's long-term well-being. Because that's something I guess that I believe, or that we believe, and the reason that we became funeral directors, and I wanted to sense check actually whether there was ever anything that's just supported that. So the first thing I did was a literature review. So I looked at all of the journals that I could get my hands on, and I tried to search for the evidence base. And what that so this was back in 2018, and what that showed, which I was very surprised at the time, is that actually there was really very limited research into funeral care, and the stuff that had been published was really kind of anecdotes, personal reflections by professionals, and from a research perspective that's relatively poor quality in terms of the types of research that you can do. So I thought this is a really important question that needs to be answered, so I contacted a few different people and tried to see whether I could engage them in this, and fortunately a very impressive lady from York University called Julie Rugg was happy to have a conversation about it, and that led to us then putting together a proposal for a research project. So I guess the long and short of it is we realised that nobody really had asked bereaved people themselves what was important in a funeral, what was important in the arrangements and then in the funeral itself, and let alone then see whether that has any impact on their longer term well-being. So we started with a two-phase research project, and what I'm sharing with you today is the findings of the first phase and then our plans for the second phase, which hopefully some of you might be able to help with. So in essence, what we did is we interviewed 53, but in the end 50 people were included. And we each interview lasted about an hour and a half. Well, it was some were relatively short, some were longer, but the average is about an hour and a half. And we asked people, following quite a strict topic guide, we asked everybody the same questions, but they were very open questions, and asked them to share the experience that they had had of either attending or participating in a funeral. And then we took all of that data and spent a long time analysing that to draw out some consistent themes that people talked about. And those are the themes that I'm going to share with you today. So we've called them the 5 funeral factors, and they are things that people consistently referred to when we were speaking to them. So I suppose just for clarity, these are not, these were a call out to anybody who had experienced a funeral in England. We weren't trying to target any particular group. So the hope was that this would reflect a sort of normal experience of funerals. We weren't focusing on who the funeral director was. So this wasn't about trying to establish, get into the dialogue about the corporate funeral directors versus independents. That wasn't really the focus. And the other thing that wasn't a big focus but inevitably came up was the whole issue about funeral poverty and the prices of funerals. So the focus very much was about people's experience of arranging it and just allowing them to speak in a semi-structured way using the topic guide. So in brief, the 5 factors are on this slide here. So I will go on and talk about each one of those in detail. But the first was about whether people's wishes were known. The second was about how decisions were made throughout the arrangement process, and with everything relating to planning the funeral. The third was whether the funeral directive was responsive to the family's needs. The fourth was about contact with the body of the person who died. And then the fifth was about the funeral itself. So I'll go on and just talk through each of those in a little bit more detail. And as I've said, please do interrupt or ask a question if you'd like to. So the first factor was about whether people's wishes were known. Now, the people that we interviewed spoke in a lot of detail about how meaningful it was to be able to fulfill wishes after someone had died, and how they really described this as a gift to the person who died. People also spoke about anxiety when wishes weren't known, because they described that they then questioned every decision and they were worried that the person who died might not be happy with the decisions that were being made. And they really spoke as if the person whose funeral they were creating was in the room, and they were, I guess, would have a view on the choices in the funeral itself. And if there were any tensions in the family, then the absence of wishes seemed to really make that worse. It made things a lot harder if as a family with some internal conflict weren't able to work to wishes that had been shared before. So what was interesting, in some cases, people had left really, really detailed wishes, including exactly what was to be put on the side of a coffin. But for most people, actually, the level of detail wasn't particularly high. They may just have said which piece of music they liked. They might have said which reading they preferred. And actually, the level of detail doesn't seem to have been important. It's more whether there was some sort of wish expressed, because the act of gifting and the emotional labour involved in being able to fulfil those wishes are the same, regardless of the level of detail. That I think was really quite interesting, and would again reflect our practice. Now something's flashing at me. Does that mean? Yes, happy to share a copy of the slides. Yes, absolutely, we'll do that afterwards. Okay, so what I've done on the bottom of each slide is just give a little quote. So the full report is available for anybody who wants to read it. And if you have found this interesting, and it's generally something you're interested in, I would certainly suggest that you read it, because what we have tried to do in the report is put quite a lot of anonymized quotes in, and it really, I think, brings quite a lot of it to life, because it's really, you know, people's personal experiences. So I will let you read it rather than me read it out to you. But I think the key here from the wishes perspective is, I think we all know this anyway, and it's something that is talked about, but it was very much about having some wishes really seemed to have a meaningful impact on people's general satisfaction with the arrangements and how they felt they had been able to engage in the funeral arrangements. So that is the first factor. The second factor was whether the decisions that were being made were felt to be inclusive. Now, funeral arrangements, as we all know, happen within the context of an existing family dynamic. So whether a family is able to make decisions together, whether they have a way of respecting the difference within their family, and whether they are able to resolve conflict in a way that it works within that family, really have quite a significant impact on people's funeral experience and their satisfaction throughout. Most people talked about a hierarchy. They might not have used that word, but they certainly had clear in their mind who should make the decisions, who kind of was the most legitimate person to drive things, either because they were older, maybe because they were closer to the person who died, maybe they were a bit more capable or more organised, but there seemed to be a clear sense. And also, really positively, is that the majority of people really talked about trying to work together. So they talked about if there was some hostility between different members of the family, they talked about trying to put that aside temporarily and then maybe picking up those hostilities again afterwards. And people really talked about being quite willing to back down. They really wanted to avoid conflict, and the majority of people really seemed to be doing their best to try and have a constructive process within their family, because they didn't feel it was worth falling out over, and quite a lot of people really seem to say that. But in some circumstances, people talked about feeling that they had deliberately been excluded from the arrangements, or their opinions were ignored, and they were the people really, out of everyone that we spoke to, they were the people who were most unhappy and dissatisfied with the funeral. So the quote at the bottom, which really we felt was quite powerful, is from a lady whose 18-year-old son had committed suicide many, many years before, and she was sharing her experience. The funeral arrangements were taken over by her ex-husband, and that seems to have been mainly because he was able to pay. So he was the person who became the client and had the majority of the interaction with the funeral director, because she wasn't in a position to be able to contribute financially. And she gave quite a powerful account of really having felt that she was excluded and her opinions were ignored, and that led to a lot of dissatisfaction on her part. So that is the second. I suspect people will have some questions later on. And I mean, this is, as a funeral director, this is of course a very interesting factor, because it raises the question to us about what we can do as a funeral director. Where does our responsibility lie? If you accept that this is an important factor and an important driver of how satisfied people may be with the funeral and how helpful it might be, then what as funeral directors can we do? How can we behave that might try and support this to be as positive a process as possible? And I'm guessing you might, I certainly have my view, and I'm guessing you may also have your views on where the funeral director may be able to contribute to this. Okay, so we have a question. How would you tackle the situation where I suppose the background issue where the person who is paying for the funeral becomes the client? So my take on this is that quite traditionally funeral directors have had a client who is either the executor or someone appointed by the executor, or a next of kin if somebody doesn't have a will. And as the funeral director, that relationship between funeral director and client, the funeral director takes instructions from the client, and it can be quite a sort of narrow relationship. So that would be the traditional, I guess, model, where the funeral director takes instructions from the client. And some people may well feel that that's appropriate and that it should be left that simple. I suppose my view is that I think as funeral directors, we have the opportunity to, you have to have a client because you need that, but you have the opportunity quite early on when you meet with the client and you start to talk about how you might support the family and what's important. My belief is that at that point you have an opportunity to maybe have a conversation about that there are a number of different people for whom this is going to be an important event, and whether it's worth considering who those people are, possibly even writing them down, which actually quite a lot of people are willing to do and find helpful, and then thinking, well, it might be quite impractical for every single one of these people to be involved in every single part of this arrangement, but maybe it's worth just bearing them in mind and thinking about whether there are ways to involve them in the arrangement, and ways to allow them to participate in a way that would be helpful. And again, in our experience, which is outside of the study, but in our experience, that seems to, the majority of times, work really quite well. If you have that conversation with a client and they acknowledge that there are other people for whom this is important and for whom the person who's died is important, actually the majority of people do appear to rise to that challenge and accept that actually, you know, there will be the opportunity to involve people and to create something that actually meets a variety of different people's needs is worth doing. So I guess my view is that as a funeral director, you have a role that you can mediate a little bit between families, but you can certainly try and set a tone in terms of how people might like to work together. So that's my view. But again, that's and I suppose part of what we hope is that as more and more research is done and published, that the people who end up regulating the funeral industry, setting a code of practice and designing training for the funeral industry, that they will be the people who will, I guess, give the direction on that and how much funeral directors are asked to do. But I think you have a powerful opportunity to do that as a funeral director. Can't quite see that message. Okay. Hopefully that answers that. So the next factor, is about whether the funeral director was felt to be responsive. Now, people clearly commented on whether the funeral director had got the tone right immediately or whether they had got it wrong. Many mentioned that the funeral director was too stiff, they were too serious, they came with a clipboard and they seemed a bit too businesslike in their manner. And that initial impression really seemed to set the tone for the ongoing relationship between the funeral director and the family, and whether that was going to be constructive and supportive, or whether, and this is how some people described it, whether it was going to be more of a battleground where the funeral director and the family were sort of wrestling for control of the arrangements. And that initial impression, that initial tone setting seemed to have been really very powerful in how the funeral director and the family were able to work together and the funeral director could support the family. So a lot of people did describe wanting information initially. They wanted practical advice about where to register the death, who did they phone, who did they need to involve, what were the statutory things that they needed to do. And they seemed, by and large, quite comfortable that that was maybe fairly formulaic, and that maybe did involve a bit of a tick box, and that they were given some fairly kind of directive information at that point about what they needed to do. And they were quite disappointed if they felt the funeral director didn't deliver that or wasn't particularly forthcoming. But then at some point, for everybody who we spoke to, they wanted the funeral director to transition into giving advice, and then being very tick boxy was no longer acceptable. People were really critical if the funeral director was too directive. And then beyond that, actually, people really wanted very different types of support. And this is where I think it became really interesting and challenges some of the, I think, preconceptions that certainly funeral directors have about what families might want and need. Some people wanted lots and lots of choice. They wanted to be presented with lots of options. Other people really did not. Some people wanted the opportunity to personalise the funeral, others really did not. And the funeral director seemed to need to really quickly understand what a family wanted and then deliver that. And also recognise that as the arrangements progressed, actually what the family might need might change, and the funeral director needed to adapt accordingly. And what was really striking is actually how people really, really wanted very, very different styles of support from the funeral director. So these statements that are sometimes made about, you know, everybody wants the funeral to be personalised, or people all want choice, or people all want control, or they all want to participate, actually that really wasn't reflected in the accounts of the people who shared their experiences and their views with us. And again, that is interesting because that has a meaningful impact on what good funeral care looks like, the skills that a funeral director needs to have, what they need to bring, how they support people. And again, as I mentioned previously, that has an impact on what a code of practice needs to emphasise and look like, and what training for funeral directors needs to look like. And I suppose what people talked about is that when they had good experiences, it's because the funeral director had got the tone right and was delivering support in a way that it felt like a co-production between the funeral director and the family. And there was really no wrestling for any kind of control or trying to get something that they weren't getting. So again, there's a quote at the bottom, which you've probably had a little look at while I've been talking, but this quote really reflects probably quite a lot of people's accounts, which was they wanted to do more than the funeral director told us we were allowed to do, which they now realise is annoying nonsense, and they could have done it themselves, which really reflected a fair few people's accounts. So that is the third. The fourth funeral factor was it relates to the time and contact that people had with the body of the person who's died. So the body was really central in how people described the funeral, and contact with the body at the right time was really quite a key element in how satisfied people were overall. What's interesting is that people talked about this contact over really quite a long time scale. So they talked about being with the body and how meaningful that was, maybe at time of death, or at home, or at the place where the person who's died, long before the funeral director comes. They talked about it again when at formal visiting or viewing at the funeral directors. And some other people spoke about it when they'd asked for the person who died to be brought home for a period of time before the funeral. And a striking amount of people, actually the most meaningful time that they spent with the body happened way before the person who died ever arrived at the funeral directors. And that sort of echoes a lot of one of the sort of underlying things that came out from the people that we spoke to is, when people talk about a funeral, they weren't talking about the 40-minute slot at the crematorium or the event itself. People were really framing that in a very different way. And some people would, started to talk about it when they were discussing wishes with the person before they'd even died. Some people, the majority of what they talked about when they were talking about their funeral experience actually was what happened at the time of death or leading up to the funeral. A lot of people spoke about the arrangements, and actually, for some people, the funeral itself didn't seem to have a huge amount of focus. It was all of the events leading up to it. And that was very much the case in relation to being able to spend time with the body of the person who died. So people placed really different degrees of social agency on the body. For some people, it was really consoling to be able to come and spend time with somebody after they died. Some people wanted to do that just once or twice. For other people, actually, a really, really key part of their entire experience was being able to come and do that a lot and regularly and have a lot of opportunity to spend time with them. Whereas for other people, it was really striking that the body became effectively meaningless to them the moment the person had died. And again, the people's perspectives on that really were so very different, which again is a really a thread that runs through all of this, is how different people's experiences and perspectives were. And it really, really raises the point that any overarching statements that are made about what anybody wants or needs are really unlikely to apply to everybody. So majority of people we spoke to assumed that the body was being cared for well. And a lot of people spent a lot of time talking about having considered what they should be wearing and how important that was. And it was really described, the choosing of clothes or not, but choosing what the person who died should be wearing was a really important ritual in the arranging process. And again, was talked about as if that was a gift. So the process of emotionally labouring over that and deciding what would be the right clothes to be wearing was a really, really helpful part of the process. Now, for those who did discuss any preparation or intervention, particularly embalming, they spoke about it very negatively. Now, I should stress that this is not a direct question that we asked. So we asked very open questions about having spent time and what that looked like, and just to share their experience. We did not ask any direct questions about any kind of physical intervention or physical care. So, but the cases where people did speak about it, the intervention that they were describing that they were unhappy with had, in every case, occurred without prior discussion with the family, and they were very unhappy about how the person looked, and also quite notably about how the funeral director seemed to be unwilling to openly discuss the care that had taken place. So although we can't draw any significant conclusions from this because we didn't ask every single participant the question, it wasn't the focus of the study, the accounts that people did share, because it was on their mind, really add strength to the argument that any physical intervention that is being carried out really ought to be done with active, informed consent of the family. I've got a flashing. Somebody's asked a question. Oh, okay, thank you. Yes, so somebody's made a comment, I think probably more on the last slide, sorry if I missed it at the right time, just saying that lack of choice in their experiences has been helpful, and that would very much reflect some of the accounts, and really just very much confirms what people were saying. They wanted really different things, and their needs need to be met, and those needs will depend on the person that you're supporting. So thank you. Yeah, so just to conclude, I suppose, on the contact with the body, this part of the research for us actually has raised more questions than it's answered, and this is a particularly difficult area, and one that I think has been particularly opaque in terms of both what funeral directors routinely do and actually what people want. And neither of those questions really seem to have been explored in any great detail. So that's something that we're looking into now, and I'll share that with you at the end, so that you have a sense of kind of where this is going. But that people's accounts really were quite striking, again, in terms of the people who did speak about it had quite bad experiences, and a lot of that was because the conversation wasn't had beforehand. Okay, and then the fifth funeral factor was whether the service itself met expectations of the person we were speaking to. So another really quite striking finding is that people found, and I've alluded to this already, people found meaning at very different points along an extended funeral timeline, and they found meaning in really quite different parts of the funeral. So with respect to the timing, some people found meaning at the point of death, some people through the arrangement process, some at a funeral service, and actually some much later with something that they decided to do. For some people, it was years later, some event or something that happened, either something they'd created or just happened informally, that they found most helpful. So for some people, the funeral service itself was not actually that important to them personally, because they had been involved in the arrangement process and they had engaged in something that really was incredibly helpful for them. But that doesn't mean that the funeral wasn't helpful or important to the wider circle of family, friends and community. So of course there will be many people who are not involved in that arrangement process, for whom the funeral may be the only point of connection, or the only event really that they can go to, which is reflecting the life of the person who's died, or it gives them the opportunity to show the importance of this event to them. Now, we deconstructed the funeral into all of its different elements, and we asked people about each element. Some people found the eulogy very important. For some people, that was a pallbearing that was the most important part of it for them. In others, it might be being able to prepare the order of service themselves, choosing a song. And there was such a wide account in what people found important. And again, that highlights that it's important that funeral directors or other people who are involved in supporting people who are creating funerals need to present opportunities to families that are quite broad and quite wide, so that you increase the chance that the family choose an aspect of the arrangement that's important to them, and they can choose the thing that's helpful, rather than maybe being given a more prescribed funeral, which might miss people finding the one or two things actually that were really helpful to them. People had really strong views about the tone of funeral that they felt was appropriate. Some people really quite clearly felt that it needed to be somber. This was to be quite a serious event, and it was not the time to be celebrating or be positive. Whereas for other people, actually, they really felt that it should have been a very celebratory event. But what was really key is that every single person we spoke to was clear about the tone that they felt was appropriate and what they wanted to create. And beyond that, there were huge degrees of variation in how personalised people wanted it to be, how involved they wanted to be, how much participation they wanted to have in the event, how much detail they wanted to put into the arrangements, how many choices they wanted to be presented with. And that has quite big implications on the skills that funeral directors and celebrants and other people who are supporting people to create funerals need. And it has quite a significant impact on the training that funeral care professionals should have, and also how we're working together with other people who are supporting families that have been bereaved. Finally, and not unexpectedly, poor performance on the day itself was really not tolerated, whether that was the funeral director not delivering, the celebrant or the officiant not delivering, or actually family members. There were quite common reflections on whether friends or family had just not behaved in a way that was felt to be appropriate on the day itself. I guess so. With all of this, the most important question is, so what? There's no point in doing any of these things if we don't ask that question and come out with some kind of answer at the end. So as I've mentioned, the report, which some of you might choose to read, has a long list of general and then quite specific recommendations about how some of these findings might be used as a platform for further research, but also how some of this might start to filter its way into practice. And the fundamental of evidence-based practice is that we use the evidence that's available to us to actually inform how funeral care is delivered. And if we accept that the 5 funeral factors are important to bereaved people, then we need to make sure that we're supporting people who are delivering funeral care to be able to really respond effectively and quickly to quite how diverse people's needs are. I think another really important thing is that we really need to consider that the funeral's happening over a much longer time scale than what we normally talk about, and that has a really significant impact on how we support people, but also how we try and make sure that we have really constructive and supportive relationships with other professionals. And that includes a huge range of other professionals. So that would be staff in the hospital, staff working in hospital mortuaries, people working in hospices, palliative care teams, crematorium staff, cemetery staff, celebrants and other officiants. And it's really, to the people that we spoke to, these distinctions were not relevant to them. And they saw this as a very fluid process. So the better that we are able to work together, the more likely we are that we can collectively deliver a really robust support to the people that we're trying to support. And we have a very narrow timescale really to do that in. So we have a couple of other questions, so we'll have a little look at those. Okay, fab, so someone just sharing their contact details, which is great. So someone's raised a great question, which is, who is the funeral for? Is it for the person who's died? Is it for the living, so the people who are attending? And this, again, we didn't ask the direct question, but it came up pretty much in people's accounts. And this is, again, depends on who you're asking. So some people spoke really clearly that it was very much for the person who had died. It was about pleasing them, making choices that would have worked for them. And this was the time to make sure that you were choosing what they would have wanted. For other people, they will have had a couple of particular people in mind who they wanted to make sure were happy. So that would have, been, I suppose, often the people who are closest to the person who's died. And it was very much the focus was, as long as they were happy and their choices were being respected, then that was fine. Other people seem to have be giving themselves a much wider remit, where they recognised that actually there was a much wider community who needed to have their needs met by this funeral, and for whom a good funeral would have a positive and long-lasting and meaningful impact. So again, it's a slightly vague answer, but I think, again, that really depends on who you're talking to. And I think it can be challenging to ask the direct question, but when we're supporting families to make funeral arrangements, it is certainly, once you get a sense of who the focus of the arrangements is for them, then that certainly should then impact on the style and the tone and the way that you're people. So I'm guessing that a lot of this feels fairly obvious and is consistent with people's personal and professional experiences. But hopefully what it begins to do is create a little bit of a framework that we can all think about working towards, because the ultimate aim obviously is to try and deliver the best possible support to families who are in a situation where they need to arrange a funeral. So I will very briefly just share what we're doing now, and then I will turn the recording off, and then hopefully everyone's happy just to put their videos back on and put the microphones on, and we can talk about whatever thoughts people have had as I've been talking. So there are two things that we're doing now. The first is we're repeating this process, but with a much narrower focus, and that is to try and understand what people's ideas, concerns and expectations are about how somebody is physically cared for after they've died. So we have completed a pilot with the topic guide that, again, we have produced in collaboration with two academics now from University of York. We've piloted that topic guide, and we now, when it's appropriate, which hopefully will be sooner rather than later, we're looking to redo this entire process, but specifically ask people about their experience of how people were cared for, what they expect, what they want, the communication around that, and how, so try and start to again gain an understanding of what people's expectations are about physical care. Running alongside that, we're trying to gain an understanding of actually what funeral directors currently do, because that also isn't really something that we currently know. So we have a survey which we had launched just before COVID, so we've had to pause, but trying to ask funeral directors to share how their physical processes once they have been appointed as funeral director and brought someone into their care. So we started that, and we were starting to get that completed, but of course we've had to stop that because the way that people are practicing during the pandemic will of course have skewed the results. So that's one piece of research that we're looking at, and hopefully we'll be looking to start recruiting shortly. And hopefully, again, what that will do is gain a much better understanding about what current practice is, and actually also what people want, and then see whether there is a gap between those and how we might look to try and bridge that gap. The second part, you'll remember at the start that a lot of this was triggered by a question about whether funeral care actually matters. Does a funeral actually have an impact on people's longer term well-being? So the first phase is what I've shared with you now that we've identified the 5 factors. The next part of the project, so phase 2, is to look at whether the presence or absence of these factors actually has any impact on people's longer term well-being. So we've been fortunate in that we found a health economist from University of Leeds who's happy to lead that part of the project. And that proposal is just being put together at the moment. So again, once that is a much larger project, which will require a much greater number of participants, and as I've said, will be led by somebody who's an expert in health outcomes and can really make sure that it's very scientifically robust from that perspective. So again, we'll share that was going to be a couple of years, I think, before we can share that with you, but that hopefully will begin to answer the question about whether all of this actually matters to people long term. So I will turn the recording off, she says, and I can stop sharing. That would be also helpful. And then